Mom kicked me out at 18 and is now begging for me to move back in because she's lonely. I-34M was kicked out of my home by my mother when I turned 18. My mother decided that her job was done and it was time for me to leave. It was on my birthday, a day that should have been filled with celebration and hope for the future. But instead, it was the day my world crumbled. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're 18 now. My job is over." I stood there, stunned and speechless, as she continued to pack my belongings into garbage bags. I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. "Please, Mom, I have nowhere to go. No money, no car, I'm not ready." But she was unmoved. She told me to figure it out, pushing me towards the door. "You're an adult now." The door slammed shut behind me, leaving me standing in the dark, alone and terrified. I spent the first few nights sleeping in my car, parked in a deserted lot, shivering under a thin blanket. The loneliness was crushing, and the fear was all-consuming. Every night, I cried myself to sleep, wishing for some miracle to take me away from this nightmare. I called my mother repeatedly, hoping she would change her mind, but she never picked up. She was too busy to care about the son she had abandoned. With no other options, I reached out to extended family members. My aunt and uncle, whom I had barely spoken to over the years, took pity on me and offered me a temporary place to stay. Their kindness was a lifeline, but it came with the heavy burden of knowing I was an extra burden. I could see the strain in their eyes, the unspoken questions about how long I would be there, and what my plan was. Finding a job was nearly impossible without a high school diploma. I took whatever work I could find, washing dishes in greasy diners, cleaning offices after hours, and doing back-breaking labor on construction sites. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay barely enough to cover my basic needs. But I pushed through, fueled by a burning desire to prove my mother wrong and to survive despite the odds. Despite the overwhelming challenges, I managed to save up enough money to enroll in night classes to earn my GED. The stress was immense. Juggling 2 jobs and school left me exhausted, with barely any time to sleep. There were days when I felt like giving up, but I reminded myself of the promise I had made, to never let my mother's actions define my future. Years passed, and slowly but surely, I started to rebuild my life. I met a wonderful woman who saw me for who I was, not for the broken person my mother had left behind. We started a family together, creating a home filled with love and laughter. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of happiness and security. We bought a modest house, cozy and welcoming, and filled it with memories and dreams for the future. Then one evening, as I was watching a movie with my kids in the living room, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Curiously, I opened it and was stunned to see it was from my mother. She wanted to meet. After 16 years of no contact, she suddenly wanted to see me. Against my better judgment, I agreed, driven by a mix of curiosity and unresolved anger. We met at a coffee shop and I was extremely nervous. She looked older and weaker, and there was a sadness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. She started by apologizing, her voice trembling. She said she was lonely and regretted the way she had treated me. She begged me to come back, to give her another chance. I sat there, listening. My heart was full of emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, and a strange sense of guilt all swirled within me. I asked her if she had any idea of what she put me through. I told her right there how she ruined my life and left me on the street abandoned. I asked her how a mother could do such a thing. She started to cry, but her tears didn't move me. They felt like manipulation, a tactic to evoke sympathy. She wanted me to feel sympathy for her, but I too was alone for all those years, and not one drop of sympathy came out of her for me. She tried to justify her actions, saying she thought tough love was the best way to make me independent, but it was too little, too late. The damage was done. I had built a life without her, and I wasn't about to let her back in to disrupt it. "I'm sorry you're lonely, but I've got my own family to worry about," I said. Her pleas grew more desperate, but I turned my back on her, just as she had done to me all those years ago. I walked out of the coffee shop. I felt some weird mix of emotions I couldn't explain, but I had learned to live without her, and I wasn't going to let her back into my life to cause more pain. Driving home, I felt a mixture of anger and relief. Anger for the years of suffering she had caused me, and relief that I had finally confronted her. But as the days went by, guilt began to creep in. She was still my mother, and a part of me felt a lingering sense of responsibility. I spoke to my wife about it, and she supported my decision. She told me that what I did was what had to be done for my well-being. But the guilt persisted. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I should have handled it differently. Maybe I should have found a way to help her without letting her back into my life. The internal conflict was exhausting, but I knew that my priority had to be my mental health and the well-being of my family. Months passed, and life went on. My children grew, and their laughter filled our home with joy. The memory of my mother's pleas faded, but the scars of the past remained. I had learned to live with them, to accept them as part of who I was. Then one day, I received another message from her. This time, it was an apology, a real one. She acknowledged the pain she had caused and asked for my forgiveness. She didn't ask for anything else, just forgiveness. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to let go of the anger and hurt. But another part of me was still too wounded. I talked to my wife about it, and she suggested writing a letter. So I did. I poured out everything I had been holding inside for years. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, but also the small moments of love and care that I remembered from my childhood. It was heavy, and for the first time, I felt a sense of closure. I decided to send the letter. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't need one. It was more for me than for her, a way to finally put the past behind me and move forward. Weeks later, I received a reply. It was short but heartfelt. She thanked me for sharing my feelings and acknowledged her mistakes. She didn't ask for anything, just expressed her regret and hope that I could find peace. And surprisingly, I did. The anger and hurt that had been a constant presence in my life began to fade. I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could choose how to move forward. I could choose to let go of the pain and focus on the present. I still kept my distance from her, but the bitterness was gone. I focused on my family, my wife, and my children who had been my rock through it all. We built a life filled with love and support, and I made sure that my children would never feel the abandonment that I had felt. In the end, I found a sense of peace. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough. I had survived the worst, and I had come out stronger. My mother's actions had shaped me, but they didn't define me. I had built a life on my terms, and for that, I was proud. So when I say that I don't want to live with her again, it's not out of spite. It's out of a need to protect the life I've built and the people I love. I wish her well, but from a distance, and that's okay. Sometimes, the best way to move forward is to let go. However, life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A year after sending that letter, my mother showed up at my doorstep. She looked rough, and her eyes were full of tears. She begged me to let her in, and that she had nowhere else to go. I was stunned. I asked her how she even found me, and she told me that she's been keeping track of me for years. My heart sank. The thought of her stalking me was unsettling. I told her that she needed to leave and she can't stay here. She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She apologized and said she didn't have anywhere else to go. Her words tugged at my heartstrings, but I couldn't let her back in. I told her that I'd moved on and did not want myself wrapped up in all this again. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation, and begged me to give her a second chance. I shook my head, and I went all out on her, asking how could she show up years later after kicking her own son out of the house and expect me to just simply forgive her. She stood up, wiping away her tears. "I understand," she said, "but please, don't shut me out completely. Just think about it." I watched as she walked away, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. I had done what I needed to do to protect my family, but the guilt lingered. Had I made the right decision? Could I have handled it differently? In the days that followed, I found myself constantly questioning my choice. My wife noticed my distress and suggested that I see a therapist to help process my feelings. Reluctantly, I agreed. Therapy was a revelation. It helped me understand that my mother's actions were not my fault, and that I had every right to set boundaries to protect myself and my family. It also helped me come to terms with the guilt I felt and find a way to forgive myself for the choices I had made. As time passed, I began to feel more at peace with my decision. My mother had made her choices and I had made mine. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose to live my life in a way that brought me happiness and fulfillment. My relationship with my mother remained distant, but I no longer felt the anger and resentment that had once consumed me. I had found a way to let go of the pain and move forward. In the end, my journey was one of self-discovery and healing. I had learned the importance of setting boundaries, protecting my well-being, and finding forgiveness, not just for others, but for myself. My mother's actions had shaped me, but they didn't define me. I had built a life filled with love, support, and happiness, and for that, I was grateful. So when I say that I don't want to live with her again, it's not out of spite. It's out of a need to protect the life I've built and the people I love. I wish her well, but from a distance. And that's okay. Sometimes, the best way to move forward is to let go. However, as life continued, I faced yet another unexpected twist. My mother's health began to deteriorate rapidly. She was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and once again, family members began to pressure me to reconcile with her. They insisted that she needed my support in her final days, and that I would regret not being there for her. The internal conflict was intense. On one hand, I wanted to stay true to the boundaries I had set for myself and my family. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was my mother and that she was dying. The guilt and confusion were overwhelming. After much soul-searching and discussions with my wife, I decided to visit her one last time. I needed closure, and I wanted to make peace with the past, if not for her, then for myself. I went to the hospital where she was staying. The woman lying in the bed was a shadow of the person I once knew. She looked fragile and vulnerable, and it struck me how time had changed us both. She opened her eyes and saw me standing there. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you for coming." I sat down beside her and took her hand. For the first time in years, I felt a connection to her. We talked for hours, reminiscing about the few good times we had shared and addressing the pain and hurt. She apologized again, and this time, it felt genuine. I could see the remorse in her eyes, and for the first time, I felt a sense of forgiveness. As the days went by, I visited her regularly. We didn't have much time left, but the time we did have was filled with healing and understanding. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough. When she passed away, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had found closure and made my peace with the past. My mother's actions had caused me immense pain, but in her final days, we had found a way to reconcile, if only partially. Life moved on, and I continued to focus on my family and my own well-being. The journey had been long and tiring, filled with pain and struggle, but also growth and healing. I'd learned the importance of setting boundaries, protecting myself, and finding forgiveness. In the end, my story is of resilience and the power of love and forgiveness. I had faced incredible difficulties and emerged stronger, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. My journey taught me that sometimes the best way to move forward is to let go of the past and embrace the present. And that's exactly what I did. In the aftermath of my mother's passing, I found myself reflecting on the complex nature of our relationship. Despite everything, I couldn't deny that a part of me had always longed for her approval, her love. It was a deep-seated need that I had carried with me throughout my life, but I also knew that I had done everything I could to heal and protect myself. The experience taught me valuable lessons about forgiveness and self-care. It made me realize that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes, it's about letting go of the anger and pain for your own sake, so you can move forward and find peace. My relationship with my family also changed. Those who had once judged me for keeping my distance from my mother began to understand the depth of my struggles. They saw the efforts I had made to build a better life for myself and my own family. Gradually, the rifts healed, and we found common ground. I focused on being the best parent I could be, ensuring that my children felt loved and supported. I wanted them to grow up knowing they could always rely on me, no matter what. My wife and I worked hard to create a stable, nurturing environment, free from the chaos and instability that had defined my childhood. The journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I had transformed my pain into strength and my struggles into resilience. I had learned to set boundaries and prioritize my well-being. And most importantly, I had found a way to forgive, not just my mother, but also myself. As the years went by, I continued to build on the foundation I had created. I advanced in my career, pursued my passions, and nurtured my relationships. The wounds of the past began to fade, replaced by a sense of fulfillment and contentment. Looking back, I realized that my mother's actions had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully understood. They had pushed me to be stronger, to fight harder, and to never give up. While I wouldn't wish my experiences on anyone, I was grateful for the lessons they had taught me.